Hello Internet, this is John McNamara, your Wilbur-Ellis agronomist at the Plattsmouth, Nebraska location. And as you can see, we've reached the next critical stage in corn development. This is known as R1 or silking. And as you pan down the plant, you can kind of see here at the top where these anthers have already opened up and released some of that pollen grain. If you look at this leaf specifically, you can see those pollen grains that have already been released. That's working on fertilizing that ear. If we look at the next plant, you can see that fertilization has already begun on this ear specifically. And how you know that is that once those silks change color or start turning purple, which will dry out and will turn into dry brown silk, which is another developmental stage that we talk about. But once they turn purple, fertilization of that ovule or the female egg part of the plant has been completed, and this will turn into a kernel. So one of the other things that we talk about this time of year is silk clipping. Now silk clipping occurs from a variety of things, primarily physical damage. Maybe it's an insect, maybe it's a hailstorm, but what I want to show you is how long these silks are on this developing ear. So when you look at this, you can see that these longer silks, and typically the ear of corn fertilizes from the base of the kernel up to the top. If you look at how many silks are thrown, which is an incredible amount of silks, you see how long these are. And the longest ones are typically here towards the base, which they generally are, and they shorten up toward the top of the plant. Remember I talked about the colored ones have already fertilized. Now it's too early in development to know these kernels at the base of the cob. Typically we harvest about 600 kernels per ear, give or take. Number of silks and kernels that are annually produced can number up to 1,000, and that's what you're generally looking at. We normally end up with maybe an ear about my thumb as far as the ones that we actually harvest. So right now is a critical time for moisture and nutritional development. Uptake, corn is using up upwards of 1/4 of an inch a day now. 30% of the nitrogen that is being utilized and applied in the plant, or I shouldn't say applied, is being utilized. And how you know where you're at on a nutritional standpoint is always from the base of the plant up. If you have discolored leaves, as an example, you can start thinking about nutritional things. We usually focus in on nitrogen because it's the widest used nutrient in corn development. But you can also look for things like phosphorus deficiencies and those types of things. Usually this time of year you can start seeing that. I don't see that in this field exactly, anything from a nutritional standpoint, but it's just things that you notice. Another thing that we focus in on, and we visited with you about in the last virtual tour, was talking about scouting for foliar diseases. I've asked Tamra Jackson-Ziems, who is the University of Nebraska Extension plant pathologist for both corn and soybeans, to visit with us this week as far as how to scout, what to look for, some of the cases that she's seen so far this year, give us a little bit more of an update as far as how to look for it and what you're looking for. So with that, Tamra, take it away.
Hi, I'm Tamra Jackson-Ziems, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist at UNL, covering corn and soybean diseases statewide here in Nebraska. This week we've been talking about a few diseases beginning to show up. Really not much out there, but we're also coming up on a time when we have full tassel emergence coming in a few fields, and people start thinking about foliar fungicide applications on corn. And that's rightfully so. And based on our data from across not only UNL data but other states, about 13 states in the country, we know that full tassel emergence, or what we call VT, has been consistently the best timing for us to make foliar applications, in that that's the timing when we tend to have a better chance of getting a return on our investment on that fungicide as far as yield at the end of the season. And it's also the time when we have the best chance of improving standability in some of our hybrids. With that in mind, there are things that you should keep in mind to increase your odds of getting a return on that investment. Number one, fungicides do a better job when you do have disease pressure, and so we always recommend scouting your corn and knowing what's out there. If you have difficulty identifying diseases that are out there, you have a lot of resources that are available. For instance, we have at John McNamara's office and shop, we have a number of our pocket guides from UNL that are available now, and he has a lot of those available to share with you, so please contact John McNamara for those. We also have a number of online resources that are also free, including videos and some free publications too. Some of the diseases that you might see developing soon could be things like gray leaf spot, and in some parts of the state we're already seeing a little bit of northern corn leaf blight development. That may surprise you with the heat and the drought that we've been having. One of the things to keep in mind though is the high humidity that we've had, and those conditions are also very favorable. The most common disease you're likely to find is going to be gray leaf spot, and we tend to see some gray leaf spot somewhere every year. Now remember, gray leaf spot is caused by a fungal disease and it overwinters in the residue. And so if you're in continuous corn, minimum tillage, you're probably at higher risk. And so watch on the lower leaves of those plants and look for rectangular lesions, because that fungus can't cross the veins and it butts right up to it and makes a rectangle. So that one's pretty easy to identify, and it marches slowly up the plant. And all it needs is high humidity and warm conditions, and we're certainly setting ourselves up now for some gray leaf spot. Northern corn leaf blight that I mentioned earlier creates bigger lesions. Those lesions can be several inches long, and they tend to be cigar shaped with rounded ends on them. This time of year when we first start seeing them, they're very small, about an inch, maybe a little bit longer, and they are rounded. And they can be scattered mainly in the lower canopy, but we're not seeing a whole lot of that just yet. In other parts of the state in particular, we are seeing a lot of bacterial leaf streak showing up. And in fact, some hybrids are quite susceptible, and so there's a lot of bacterial leaf streak in some of the lower leaves. So I would be watching for bacterial leaf streak, and if you've never seen it, look for the jagged irregular lesions that can be tan, orange in color, and when you hold it up to the sunlight and you backlight it, you're going to notice some bright yellow discoloration. That's really key for this disease because it produces a yellow pigment. It's important to know what that one is though. Being bacterial, you can't control that with a foliar fungicide. So as you think about your foliar fungicides and making that decision and which hybrids are more suitable and may perform better with a fungicide, keep in mind susceptibility to diseases and the history of disease in that particular field. Across our 13 states worth of data, 80% of our foliar fungicide applications resulted in a yield increase. Not all of those were enough to pay for themselves though. We were much more likely to get an economic return when fungicides were applied at that tassel timing or shortly thereafter, and when we had 2 or more modes of action of fungicides in that mixture. And so please keep that in mind as we move forward. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to John McNamara or one of the other staff at Wilbur-Ellis or someone in Nebraska Extension, and we'll be glad to help you. Thank you. So when we're talking about soybean, we are anticipating what diseases might show up soon. And although we're beginning to see a little bit of bacterial blight out here, we expect at some point soon we'll start seeing things like frog eye leaf spot and eventually septoria brown spot in that lower canopy. In particular though, I want to visit about frog eye leaf spot and some new updates we have about that disease. Last year in Nebraska, we collected samples of frog eye leaf spot from soybean fields in 10 Nebraska counties. And this was not a diligent survey where we were trying to really scour and get good coverage. We were just trying to get our hands wet to see what was out there. Unfortunately, every one of those samples came up fungicide resistant to the group 11, or what we call strobilurin fungicides, better known as the quinone outside inhibitors, or QOIs. Well, this isn't a huge surprise. If you look in other states, we've actually observed fungicide resistance to the strobilurins for a number of years in other states south of us especially. And so Even in January, Iowa reported over 50 counties in their state have confirmed fungicide resistance. And so we believe this could be more widespread, and we want to document that better. But for you, for now, and when you're scouting for frog eye, keep in mind if you find frog eye lesions, and you'll know it because those lesions will be in the upper canopy. They are small, circular to elliptical, tan to gray lesions with a dark brown or purple lesion or margin around them. That's frog eye leaf spot, and some varieties are more resistant or susceptible than others. If you believe you need a fungicide, having fungicide resistance complicates your decision. Although strobilurins or the QOIs used to be the most effective fungicides to apply, and they do their best job, all of them, between that R3 and R5 timing. What you need to know now is that you should assume that the strobilurin in that package is not going to help you manage that disease. So instead, you need to focus on the other fungicide classes. Well, unfortunately, in row crops right now, we're only using products primarily from 3 classes of foliar fungicides. The strobilurins, or the QOIs that I just mentioned, the triazoles that we've been mixing them with for a number of years that provide some curative activity, and now more of the SDHI products as well. So the strobilurin, or the QOI, is probably no longer effective in many of those fields. And so that leaves you only 2 products, the SDHI and the triazole, to focus on. Keep that in mind when you're selecting your fungicide, and be sure and select ones that have those components in it, or a 3-way fungicide, and we have a number of those to choose from now. In addition, watch for other diseases out there, and don't confuse them with some of our bacterial diseases like bacterial blight and bacterial pustule. And again, if you have questions, consult with John McNamara, or also go to many of the free resources you have from Nebraska Extension. Thank you.
As Tamra mentioned, all hybrids are better with a fungicide application, some more than others. So we like to visit with our growers, suggesting hybrids that look like they might benefit from a fungicide better. Things like 6088 are hybrids that we know react better to a fungicide application. Things like 6435 that inherently have a better genetic tolerance to things like gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight. Yes, it can happen with 6435. However, the incidence or the genetic tolerances with that hybrid specifically are better than what we find maybe with 6088. So please visit with us surrounding which hybrids would react better or worse, or less, I should say. Like I say, fungicides are always better. They make the agronomic and the yield performance of any hybrid better. With specific genetic packages, they make a lot more sense. This week we want to visit about a new 114-day hybrid in 6465, and a couple of things along the way that we talk about with breeders and advancing hybrids is plant phenotype, or the structure, the architecture of the plant, if you will. Now you might be able to see a couple differences here between 6435, 6465, and 6595 as far as how the plant looks. Some of these hybrids, 6435 is one of a later class. The new 6200, that's a white corn, is in that grouping. That is what we call an erect canopy. Hybrids that are bred really skinny and tall. And that's a breeding attempt to basically cram as many plants per acre into a space as possible. Now, whether you're in 20-inch spacings or 30-inch spacings, you know, that's kind of where the challenge is from a breeding standpoint, is to try to create as much surface area on that plant as possible, and that's kind of the erect architecture, if you will. The big droopy floppy leaves of maybe 5 or even 10 years ago are kind of fading away. Now there's always crosses involved. If the female has got an agronomic trait such as green snap tolerance or disease package or those types of things, and they cross it with a male that has more of an erect canopy to it, you might have a cross between that. It might not be as evident. Some hybrids show it, some don't. But I've said this many times, it's all a beauty contest until you put it in the bin. So a little background as far as where the breeding of not only DeKalb hybrids, but in generally the industry is going, is that they're looking at a taller, skinnier plant, trying to utilize that plant canopy and space per acre as much as possible. So we are in front of one of the newer releases. 6435 has been a long-standing hybrid the last 4 to 5 years. It's been one of our better ones from a yield standpoint. Now, you might think about, well, it's so good, why are you trying to replace that? Last year, we brought 6595, which is another good dry land, tough soil, plant it wherever, plant it whenever hybrid. What 6595 offered over 6435 was a little bit faster emergence, and it also offered yield. If 6435 has a downfall, it's slow out of the ground. It's not a hybrid that I'd plant early, and it has a tendency to green snap on occasion. In its lifetime, it's done it once, and it did it once about at this stage of development, right at pollination, which is typical of hybrids right now. Any hybrid can snap, given the right velocity, given the right direction of the wind, but there are some that are more genetically prone for snapping. On the flip side, 6435, like we mentioned earlier, probably one of the better disease packages later. So now we bring out 6465. Why? Yield is really what it comes down to. 6465 over 6435 offers some of the same diversity, some of the same balance, some of the same proven performance, not only from a yield standpoint, but also a disease package. But the testing that we've seen so far versus 6435, it's about a 5 bushel advantage in some of the breeder trials. And you've heard me talk about PCM 3, 4, and 5 trials before, and that's where this data is generated from. So when we put it into a trial like this, there are 5 within the Wilbur-Ellis Plattsmouth ranch just like this. That's included in the Southeast Nebraska district, of which we'll have somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 locations side by side this year to validate that 5 bushel increase in yield. So always remember, new genetic releases are not trying to defeat hybrids that have been very stable and performing for you in the past. It's something to always offer you more in yield. So look for 6465 in some of our yield trials and yield data that we'll have for you in October. 6595 be a nice companion for it. So we have 2 good high-end, high-performing offerings in that 114 and 115 day material.
Here is an update on the Marestail and status herbicide experiment located at the Minard plot. You can see in this picture and the video upcoming on the right from June 1st that the Marestail covered this entire area of the corn and beans. Now, on July 10th, they are completely controlled.
Along the developmental side of things, we also want to talk about soybeans. So much of the soybeans are approaching full bloom, and you can see with some of these earlier planted beans what's going on. I'm pointing to my finger. These are blooms that have already aborted. Now, soybeans, like we've talked about before, can abort 60, maybe even upwards of 70-75% of the blooms that are annually thrown. However, you can see the constant regeneration of blooms at each node. Even though some of them have dried up and died already, there is always a constant regeneration. Much like the corn plant, reproduction stage starts kind of at the lower portion of the ear/lower portion of the plant. So if you look at this, you can start to see just the initiation of pod development, which seems early, but with a late group season 2 bean like this one is, these are 27X8s, and these were planted, I believe, on the 10th of April. It's not uncommon to see pod development just kind of starting right there where my thumb is. Another thing that you see this time of year, kind of here up on some of that earlier growth, is Japanese beetle / woolly bear or thistle caterpillar feeding. We talked about that last time. And this is no different of what's going on. Now, remember what I talked about as far as 30% of defoliation of the plant before it becomes economical. And we're far from that. You have to look at it from a grand scheme of things as far as how many leaves truly have feeding. That leaf specifically, the argument might be 50% or so of the vegetation has been lost. How much has been lost on the entire plant is things that you want to remember. So Japanese beetle thistle caterpillars are certainly around. It's nothing that I would consider to be an economic threat at this point. The other portion about it is as we continue into full bloom, there are any applications, whether it's an insecticide or herbicide, those types of treatments with or without adjuvants have a tendency to abort more blooms, and we're trying to prevent that as much as we can. So one of the common things that happen this time of year as we approach middle of July is inevitably we always have soybeans that have been cupped, or they're curled and they have leathery texture to the leaves and they generally look bad. Dicamba type products are always pointed as the culprit of said cupping. Many times that's not even the case. There are genetic issues, there are adjuvant issues, there are hormonal things going in with the plant, and many times an unknown thing is that some of the genetics that are involved in said soybeans can also cup these things. So you can kind of see what's going on with this plant, contrary to what we were talking about here just a minute ago. What's happening is that these nodes are starting to stack on top of each other. You can see where this injury has occurred. When I talk about leathery leaves or a drawstring leaf, that's generally what's happening. And as that drawstring occurs and you pull it more towards the stem, it kind of makes them cup. Now, here's the salvation of what's going on with this plant. You can kind of see the flower nodes, how they're bunching up on some of these lower nodes. And even though this plant is going to be noticeably shorter, you can kind of see where those pods the blooms are beginning to develop. Here's the other good news. This new growth, or this new trifoliate, is going to come out normal. So when we talk about stressing soybeans, when we talk about, geez, it had hail, or it had a dicamba, or a 2,4-D, or maybe some foliar feeding from an insect, uncharacteristically, soybeans that are stressed seem to turn out all right. It's not that we recommend doing any of this by any stretch of the imagination. However, it's a little thing called apical dominance, and we talk about that primarily after a hailstorm, where that growing point gets sheared off or injured, or maybe it's from a herbicide, maybe it's from physical injury, and it promotes the flowering and the node development toward the lower portion of the plant. Here again, look at some of these new growths and see how they've budded out, and they're going to come out fine. So it looks bad. Soybeans have the innate ability to put up with a lot of things, and this is one of them. Here again, I'm not trying to undermine or underestimate the potential of off-target movement of herbicides. What I am trying to say is that it has a tendency to be blamed for the problem more than it needs to be.